Hello everyone, this is me Fabricio. So I wanted to take this time and this opportunity to have sort of a breakdown of the course. And why is that? Because I think it's going to help you to basically have the notion of what is American literature about, and what are some of the topics we're going to be covering, and some of the ideas, themes, and terms that and concepts that we're going to follow throughout the course. So I think it's going to be good for you to have kind of like a clearer scope and sequence of the course. All right, here we are. Let's get started with this. So basically, the first idea that I want you to keep in mind is that in this course, you need to know about content. It's very important that this course does require from you to know about the movements, works, and historical context. You also need to know about the authors that wrote them. I just want to stress that this is a content course. When you go through this entire course together, I really suggest that you further some of the readings, you follow the suggestions, you study the modules, and you study study, and you also watch the videos over and over, because this is a content course. You'll need to know names and places and people and movements, and not just that, but how they all interact. Hopefully with this course I'll be able to do that with you and facilitate this process for you. Now, the genres mostly covered are the novel and short stories. There's very little essay, very little autobiography, and very little drama. Just a word on that. I mean, yeah, a lot of this stuff, as I said, is very little essay. Our idea of an essay is I'm going to write an essay for my class, but keep in mind that a lot of the things that we're going to be reading may not be considered as essays per se, but some of it will be in essay form. Why? Because they might be excerpts of philosophical treatises, maybe like, for example, to Ross Walden, and you might see something in there that might look like an essay form because it's not fiction. Autobiography, that's another section that there's not going to be in there, but you do have to know about people and their relationship and who they are. We're going to see some like spiritual autobiographies a bit at the beginning, so there's a little bit in there about that. Drama here, that connection is also made if you think about it, with sometimes there's an overlap between some poetry and drama, like in Shakespeare. We're not going to study Shakespeare, but a lot of his dramas were mixed into poems, and there was a lot of that overlap that I'm talking about. Not excluding this, I'm just saying that most of it is novels and short stories for this course. So here's a breakdown of periods of subject matter. We got the colonial, that's going to be 15% of the colonial, and early national period. This is going to be from the very beginning of the Americas all the way up to about 1830. Then after that, we're going to hit the Romantic period. You'll see the Romantic period stretches about 40 years there. So there's a lot of Romantic period that's very intense in the beginning, but a lot of the Romantic writers, even though the period had kind of waned, it's still alive, and they kept writing in the style for many years, the style that they knew. In some countries, there's two phases of Romanticism. There's an earlier and later phase. We look at both together, the earlier Romantic period and the later Romantic period. I'm also going to try to explain to you all these movements and how they react to one another in that sense. And now we have the period of realism and naturalism. That's going to be about 20% of the course. You can see that's just at the turn of the century. That kind of coincided there with the Industrial Revolution a little bit before that. You can see how the realism and the naturalism, it has a good chunk there for 40 years. That's going to be something that we're going to focus on. That has, a lot of literature was written during that time, a lot of novels and stuff. We're going to have to look at that excerpts and summaries and things like that. 25% of the modern period from 1910 to 1945. We are going to look at that also. Then the contemporary period, some writers that you may even recognize now that are possibly still alive. We're going to look at those, and pretty much that's the American literature in terms of periods. Like I explained it at the beginning of the course, there's a 45% to 60% knowledge of literary works, including authors, characters, plots, setting, style, and themes. We look at these things like the authors, for example, when we ask who wrote the book, who are the main characters, protagonists, antagonists, supporting characters. Some of those are sometimes very important. For example, when we look at the Scarlet Letter, that is going to be a book we're going to study, there's a lot of characters in there, but some of them are secondary characters, but play an important role during the story. The plot, what's happening with that? Maybe there are a couple of plots, maybe there's a subplot. The setting, the time and space, the time and space where those things are taking place. When you think about time and space, like for example, Nathaniel Hawthorne was written during the Romantic period, but he wrote about 200 years before that. Like the Scarlet Letter, when he wrote that, it's based on something way before. These are the things that we need to also keep in mind when we talk about setting, because obviously influences the style of the writer. The style is going to influence the period very much in which it was written. The Romantic style is going to be a lot of different from a realist style. But even in those different movements, each author, each writer is going to have his or her own style that's personal to their characteristics. Even if they have their own style, however, and it happens sometimes, they might change it in the future, and they change it over time. Themes, a lot of themes are really important because we're going to look at some of the symbolism involved here, some of the metaphors, and a lot of things that reflect the times. We're going to look at that as we move along the course. Besides that, 20% to 40%, it's going to be the ability to understand and interpret short poems, excerpts from long poems, excerpts from prose works. Short poems, we can see those up on the screen very easy to look at that. Excerpts from long poems, there's a lot of epic poems, narrative poems that will be a whole book, but we're going to make it a chapter only. It just happens to be in verse form, so we're obviously going to see excerpts from those so we can see how it's written. Excerpts from prose work, we can have an entire Mark Twain novel here, so we're going to look at excerpts. Then maybe we'll talk about the way the dialogue is written, or maybe the way the language is particular to a movement or particular to an author. 10 to 15%, it's going to be knowledge of the historical and social settings of a specific work. I mean, obviously at the beginning, when we look at this with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, this is very important for the beginning of America, the United States in that sense. The background, it's important, so we're going to look at some of the people and what motivated, because obviously religion played a huge key in the type of literature that was produced, spiritual biographies, for example. A lot of the stuff that was produced is a sign of the times. Understand the context, It really helps you to put things in place. The relation between literary works. Some people might influence other writers. Some people might influence, from another movement. If it's an action or a reaction, those are the things that we need to look at, like relations of specific words to literary traditions, what makes it romantic writing, what makes it the realist writing, what makes this particularly one way or another. For example, like in the case of Walt Whitman, he's kind of right in the middle between romanticism and realism, philosophical realism. We can look at that and see how he has a lot of the subjective qualities of the romantic movement. We'll also see how he has the sense of realism because he reaches out to the American public. He discusses the whole idea of America. There's a lot of different, sometimes there is an overlap there. Influence on authors. What influences an author to write a certain way? Obviously, religion is going to influence that. They're going to write about God, or later when we get to the transcendentalism, we'll see the way that people are moving away from religion and moving more into transcendentalism, idealism, different types of movement we're going to look at. That's going to be important because as people move into a more secular framework, they're thinking about other things instead. That's going to be a great focus of what we look at. 5 to 10% familiarity with critical terms, verse form, and literary devices. We'll take a chapter to look at this at the end of the course. A couple of terms, forms, devices. Is this a sonnet? Some literary devices there. It's, if it's a metaphor, is this a simile? Are they using personification here? When you have the sounds together to create a specific sound, what is that? Is that alliteration? Is that personification? What is that? We'll look at that later on. As you can see, there's quite a bit to cover. So we'll go through the chronology of the works, including the movements, authors, and historical context, as is expected of you all to know. Thank you very much. I hope you find this podcast helpful, and we're going to see each other in a future session.